Hey everybody, welcome back to Choose Inclusion. This is Yubi and I'm here with Mr. Michael Hess. How are you, Mike?
Fantastic, my friend.
Good, good. Well, welcome back. This is a continuation of our Black Voices Matter segment. And today we've got a really great voice out of Denver, Colorado. He's known as the Soul Food Scholar. He's also the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches. And so we're going to talk about both of those kind of roles and how they relate to Black Lives Matter and the conversation that's happening around racism right now. So Adrian Miller, welcome to the show. And how are you doing? How are you feeling?
Well, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, man, it's mixed emotions. These days I've been really thinking about kind of three things broadly. So the first is what I've been telling people lately is I always think about my father. My mother died a few years ago, but my father is here with us, and he's 80 years old, grew up in rural Arkansas, and in the segregated South. And so I try to have dinner with him every Sunday night. And recently I asked him, I just said, what do you think about what's going on? How do you think this is going to play out? And he said, I really never thought it would get this bad after the civil rights legislation was passed. And he grew up at a time where, if you looked a white person in the eye, if you were a person of color and looked a white person in the eye, especially if you're Black, you're asking for trouble. So for him to kind of lose hope in that sense was really poignant for me. And in this moment, I'm just trying to figure out what my role might be, because I do think I have some gifts that I can bring to the conversation. But part of it is just figuring out, let me back up. We've had these kind of moments in the past. And usually what happens is there's a lot of energy in the moment. Then starts to dissipate after a few months. This time feels different. And I'll say this because just from what I've observed, white people are looking at things in a different way, and stuff that I never would have imagined would have happened, say like 2 months ago, or now these things are happening. For instance, Colorado, we passed a police accountability piece of legislation in like a week and a half. That never would have happened before. Mississippi is now considering taking the Confederate flag out of their state flag. And I'm not sure if it's just something the governor can sign or if they can send it to voters. But still, the fact that that's even happening is just really tremendous. And then what I'm seeing that really gives me encouragement is I'm seeing white people engage other white people on race. Because what I've told people is, if I talk about my experiences with race, and I've been blessed because I have had very few run-ins with the cops, but I've had them. And I know that my rights were being violated, but I've never had a gun drawn on me like my friends have. So to see other white people engaging their friends, family, and peers on race, I think that's where we're going to get the real breakthrough. Because when I share things, I think people, because it's so outside their experience, they may discount it or dismiss it outright. And then I'll just close out with saying that I also think about the words of Gianna Floyd, who was George Floyd's 6-year-old daughter, who after his murder said, "My daddy changed the world." And so the challenge for all of us of goodwill who want to see a shared future where we have equality for everyone is, can we make Gianna's words really come to fruition this time? Because I thought we would be in this place right now, this moment, 5 years ago, when that guy went into that Black church in Charleston and killed the Bible study group that had welcomed him. I thought that was so horrific that would bring us to this moment, but it just never really happened. But I think in this moment, the video of George Floyd being killed and how no excuses can be made, because I think in the past when other incidents like this have happened, even when caught on film, people have said, oh, well, he was breaking the law or he was resisting arrest or whatever. But the way that George Floyd was killed, there's just no excuses can be made for that. And it was horrific. And I think it's just touched people in a different way.
Adrian, thank you for sharing those like that. And I'm an eternal optimist, and I really hope that George Floyd's daughter's words do absolutely do come true. And I agree, there's something different now, because not only are white people, having this discussion with their inner circles, with their families, with everybody, but I also you have companies, so for a a cause to be sustained, at the end of the day, how it lasts more than 2 or 3 months is based on resources. And you see, I mean, companies like Netflix and Google and I mean, really, really large mega companies like committing, hundreds of millions of dollars to Black companies, to Black Lives Matters, to all of these organizations to help sustain this effort, because at the end of the day, you and I both know that that's what it's going to take for this to last more than the 2 or 3 months.
Absolutely. And we're just seeing that. And we're seeing it in so many different spaces. And we're seeing African Americans step up. I mean, LeBron James is coming up big time right now. I think he's pledging $100 million or something like that. So yeah, it just feels different.
So you've written books on the history of Black chefs in the White House. You've also written books and you were just turning in edits on another book, but really looking at sort of African American food and what are your thoughts on food and how it could maybe help bridge some of these gaps between people, how it might be able to help drive change as well? Is that possible?
Yeah, I believe so. I think food is just a powerful tool that can be used for good or or evil. And let me just put it this way. So if you look at the story of, say, in a cuisine like soul food, or just even African American food in the Americas, enslaved people were brought here to do uncompensated labor, and food was one of the tools of oppression. In this sense, is that on plantations or really in any kind of slavery context, for the most part, the slaveholder would control the amount of food that enslaved people got. So on the larger plantations, once a week, the enslaved people would be given 5 pounds of some starch, could be cornmeal, rice, or sweet potatoes typically, 2 pounds of meat that was either smoked, salted, or dried. Typically that was pork, but it could be beef or fish, and a jug of molasses. And then otherwise, the enslaved people had to figure out how to subsist by gardening, foraging, hunting, fishing, and doing all of these other things to supplement the during a typical day for an enslaved person is at the crack of dawn, there would be a trough. People were fed out of a trough, just like animals, filled with cornbread, crumbled up cornbread and buttermilk. And people had to eat with their fingers or maybe a seafood shell, like a clam shell or a mussel shell, because a fork or a knife was a potential weapon. And slaveholders did not want enslaved people to arm themselves. Then the midday meal was similar. The trough was cleaned out, and then in that midday meal, there would be a trough full of seasonal vegetables, maybe a little bit of meat to season the vegetables, and then supper at the end of the day was leftovers from the midday meal. So that you just see how that keeping people hungry, chronically hungry, and using food to oppress, you saw that as a tool for bad. And then even after emancipation, we see food being weaponized. Very toxic stereotypes of African Americans through food developed during that time period because African Americans have been granted new rights given the amendments to the Constitution and federal civil rights legislation that was passed in the 1870s. So at that moment in time in the 1870s, African Americans had a chance to be full participants in the society. And so the people who had lost the Civil War and still were not interested in Black progress decided to launch a culture war and essentially use food to say, oh, African Americans are different, they're childlike, or they're bestial. And essentially the message was, hey, these people are inferior, they don't deserve these rights. And with that constant campaign that was started in the South, but people outside the South were very happy to consume those stereotypes and even pass them on to others. By the late 1890s, mid 1890s, we get Plessy v. Ferguson, which basically legally enshrines segregation based on that Supreme Court decision. So we see that the culture war was working. And a lot of the toxic foods were fried chicken, watermelon, catfish, barbecue. Even to this day, I know some African Americans who are very reluctant to eat fried chicken or watermelon in the presence of white people. And even today, if there's a Martin Luther King celebration or a Black History Month celebration that involves food and it has fried chicken or watermelon involved, even if it's organized by an African American, other African Americans will protest that event, and usually they get canceled. But I'd like to end on a hopeful note by saying that I think food has the power to reconcile us because we all eat. We can come to the table, and when you sit down to eat with somebody, you recognize their humanity. It's a time where people drop their guard, and you can start to talk and just get to know each other. And also, cooking is an act of love. I mean, when somebody cooks for you, they're saying they care about your survival. They're saying that I love you. Even if the food is straight nasty, just the act of going through and preparing that food is meaningful. And I think if we can create spaces in our lives where we have that, opportunities to just eat with each other, to listen and talk and hear each other, we might have a chance to work this out.
Wow. So the straight nasty. Apparently, you've heard about my cooking, Adrian. So I think. Yeah. So I couldn't agree more with. So I did not know. I honestly I don't know. I guess I didn't really know the stereotype about some of those foods, to be honest. And B, I guess I didn't. Again, that's what I love about this episode is truly educating, and I didn't realize like that. So those foods could actually stop an event for a Dr. King kind of event. That's just fascinating to me. I definitely agree though that breaking bread with people is, I mean, it's as old as humanity, and getting more people to the table to have discussions about this is the way it could be done. Can you talk though about, some of the, I know you've got books on this, like, what some of the foods that are, the Black culture bring to America. And I'd love to know, again, because I don't know some of these things. I didn't know watermelon. I didn't know catfish. None of that. I truly didn't know that. I'd love to know some of the other rich, Black culture foods that we get to enjoy and we do enjoy.
Oh man, do you feel like something's been missing in your life?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. So an example of a food that comes from some foods that come from Africa, you talked about watermelon, which is like Central Africa. An interesting thing about watermelon is it actually comes to the Americas via the Spanish before a large number of enslaved Africans arrive. And it was embraced by Native Americans. So watermelons were growing all over the place by the times that enslaved Africans arrived here. So much so that people thought it might have been native to the Americas. Another example is okra. That's another food that shows up via the slave trade. There was a type of sesame seed that came over. It was called bene seeds, but essentially it was sesame seeds. There's another thing called hibiscus. I don't know if you've ever had a hibiscus tea or not, but that's a flower that's native to West Africa. And that essentially was a hospitality drink in West Africa that called bissap, which essentially you just get some water, you steep the flowers in that water and then sweeten it to taste. That drink comes to the Caribbean and then makes its way around Latin America. So in the Caribbean, like especially Jamaica, it's called sorrel. And then when it makes its way around Latin America, it gets called agua de Jamaica, which is Jamaica water. So when you go to a taqueria and order that drink, you're actually drinking a riff off a West African drink. And then, what we find in other aspects of kind of soul food and African American food culture is you find basically enslaved people coming to the Americas, not being able to eat all of the foods that they necessarily had back home because they were moving from a tropical climate to a temperate climate. So you just couldn't grow the same foods. So often what they had to do was find substitutes. So one example is greens. In soul food culture, the popular greens are collard, kale, mustard, turnip, and cabbage. Well, these are all bitter greens. And the interesting connection is in West Africa, a lot of West Africans ate bitter greens. They called it bitter leaf. So they couldn't have bitter leaf in the Americas. So what they did is they substituted the European bitter greens that they had encountered. So I tell people, if you've discovered kale in the last 5 to 10 years, welcome to the party. We've been eating it for about 15. And then some other foods would be like sorghum and millet. So, but the rest of soul food is really embracing food already here in the Americas or adopting the foods of their European slaveholders. And so soul food is really one of the earliest fusion cuisines in the US.
Well, and it just I am just completely fascinated by this conversation of the weaponization of this food. And I mean, it speaks to just truly how embedded and systemic everything is. And that's why I love this conversation, because I want white people in particular to understand that. But in order to do that, they've got to see everywhere that it's systemic, right? That it's embedded, and it's food. It's, it's every policy and procedure at work. It's, it's rent, mortgages, right? That the socioeconomic ways that this is just held an entire community of people back purposefully, right?
Yeah. So one of the fascinating things that's happening right now is that a lot of those stories and underpinnings are being peeled away, and people are starting to understand that. They're starting to understand how policing, not rooted entirely, but definitely influenced by these volunteer white slave patrols that would just go in the South, operate in the South looking for fugitive enslaved people. They were called patter-rollers. We don't know that how much tipping, which is a way of not paying somebody a full wage, was influenced by the number of African-American waiters. So, we're starting to see how much race really permeates our society in a way that just people just really didn't even know. And let me give you one anecdote. Recently, something that's been in the news has been the Tulsa riots of 1920, where an entire community was destroyed. So I have two friends who are from Tulsa. One is a woman in her mid-60s. The other is a guy in his early 30s. Both of them have, before they came to Denver, they'd spent a lot of their life in Tulsa, grew up there. They had never even heard of those riots.
Well, and a lot of people heard about it because of the show Watchmen, right? On HBO.
Yeah, the show Watchmen, and also President Trump's rally there.
Right.
When people were giving context to that, that's when they started to learn about it. So, most people in the country didn't know about that, but people even in that community didn't know about it. So that shows you what David Shipler, an author, wrote this term, but I really love it. It just speaks to how we are a nation of familiar strangers. We know of each other, but we really don't know each other's stories. And I think part of this moment and why people are trying to find out more about racism and systemic racism and other things is I think they're trying to, for a moment, in this moment, they're trying to find out more about the African-American story.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Mike.
I'm fascinated with this conversation and with you, Adrian, on this topic. Thank you. I was going to ask if we could shift gears, because you, besides being an acclaimed author and attorney at law and all, like so many other, you've also got a really cool venture that you're doing right now that is creating social impact by doing something else that, quite honestly, is maybe not unheard of, but super rare here in Colorado. Can you talk more about your social impact and faith?
Yeah. So there is a food connection, because at least in the Christian church, the early church was actually potluck meals at people's homes. That's how the early Christians really got together and start to build the church. So that's a little just fun fact. But I'm the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches, and we represent 13 Christian denominations, mostly the mainline Protestant denominations. And so we're a coalition of about 800 churches across the state. And if you've never heard of the Colorado Council of Churches, we're the ones who host the Easter sunrise service at Red Rocks. which is now is going into its 74th year. So
Oh, wow. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
definite fixture of our community. Yeah. So one of the things that I've been really interested in is like, how do we come together? And my observation in our society is we have fewer and fewer spaces where we can come together and talk about the tough things. And faith churches, synagogues, mosques, they're one of the few spaces left. So one of my passions has been trying to get the faith community together to talk about race. And one of the most successful events I did that through was a giant potluck, where basically I asked people to bring food from their own faith tradition and sit down at the in the space, the venue that we had, sit down with somebody you don't know and just talk to them. And at the end of the conversation, see if it's possible for you to maybe do something ongoing with a diverse church. So before going into that, Black pastors were very cynical. They just said, look, Adrian, we've seen this movie before. These white churches, they don't want to do the work of reconciliation. They just want us to come and preach Martin Luther King Jr. weekend and check off a box. And just by pure coincidence, this was I had this in the works just around the time of that church shooting that I mentioned earlier. And I said, no, I just think we're in a different moment because of everything that's happening in our society. And they said, okay, we'll see. Sure enough, we had like 200 people show up. Very great event. Out of all those people that showed up, we really only had 3 churches that kind of committed to doing some ongoing relationship building. And about 3 weeks later, I checked in with the white pastor of one of those pairings, and she said, we're doing some stuff, but my congregants are asking me, why do we keep doing stuff with that Black church? Which fed completely into what the Black pastors were saying. The other thing is, I can tell you, there are pastors who do want to talk about race, but they're hindered because one, there are people in their pews that just don't want to hear it. They want to be in a safe space. They want to live in a bubble. They want to just not talk about race. Even though the person they profess to follow, and I'm talking about Christians, talked about social justice and loving everyone, they just don't want to be bothered with that. Anecdotally, I know some faith leaders that when they preach Black Lives Matter from the pulpit, people get up and leave. Now, you know what a breach of protocol that is. I know other people that have tried. There's a church in Denver that has Black Lives Matters on its marquee. It routinely gets vandalized. So people are coming on the church property and destroying a marquee just because they don't want to see that wording. And the other thing is, there are people that threaten to withhold donating to the church, and there are people who actually don't stop donating to the church if they think that the faith leader, the pastor, is way out there on race. So my experiences are with the Christian church, but it's very disheartening. And I can tell you, as the leader of the Colorado Council of Churches, I have an email newsletter distribution list. Whenever I do an email that explicitly talks about something dealing with race, especially racial justice, I automatically get unsubscriptions. It's just going to happen. So there were really 2 surprises from that. My first surprise was, wow, I didn't know people read my emails. And then the second surprise is, wow, we're Christians. We're supposed to love one another, and we can't even just handle hearing about an event that's going to talk about race. That's too much to handle. Kind of like, what's up with that? So again, this time is different. I have a number of white churches who are reaching out to me and saying, hey, we want to do a curriculum on race and a lot of different things. So this may be a different moment. We'll just have to see how it plays out.
I think, yeah, it speaks to how this maybe is such an individual fight, like I think if we're ever really going to see change, I feel like there's got to be a lot of individual work that everybody has to do, because you can have different people of the same faith, for example, but if those people who are refusing to donate and who are upset by a Black Lives Matter banner on their church, like that, I don't know, that to me is a very personal individual fight. And I think that's that's it's like it's a spectrum, I guess, is what I'm seeing. It's like we've got to fight it at that level, as well as, where you've got these big companies and these big brand names and these very influential things who also have to take a stand, right? If we're going to see this change happen.
Right. So, one question is, well, what turns on a light bulb for a person to do that personal work? What leads a person to do that? I don't have a great answer for that. Second question is, what motivates a person to go into a space to discuss this issue with other people, knowing that they may be seen as the bad person simply because of their skin color, which is, messed up, or they may fear that they're going to say the wrong thing. So I think the lack of safe spaces to talk about race is actually hindering some of these discussions, because I think people are just reluctant to go into those spaces, because you got to be a special kind of cat to walk into a space like that.
Well, I agree. Maybe a special kind of cat, but I also like. So what is the what's the own beating in your own heart? Again, like, so whatever impact small that you can have. So again, Nina and Ubaldo and myself, like leveraging a small platform of this podcast to talk about this, and special cat or not, and I Ubaldo, yes, Nina, yes, me, whatever. It's about saying, okay, it's 2020, ladies and gentlemen, right? Or however you'd identify, but it is 2020. Can we like our world is diverse. Okay. Inclusion is something that's got to be intentional. And in places like churches, and that infuriates me to no end, to think that, like they call him the ultimate teacher in the Christian in the Christian faith.
Right.
And I'd love to know, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but I'd love to know. Well, first and foremost, that ultimate teacher was not Caucasian. Okay. He was from a part of the world where he wasn't a white guy. Okay. So can we, historically start talking about that? And then, but where does he is there somewhere in the Bible? Please tell me, Adrian, that he talks about black people in a way that is demeaning. Is that what the great teacher did? Is that why so many white churches can't talk about this? Like, I'm curious. I'm fascinated.
Well, actually, it's an interesting question. So Jesus. So the one thing is, we have to separate kind of what Jesus says in the Bible and the rest of the Bible, because if you just look at what Jesus talks about, a lot of Christians are paying attention to things that he either said very little about or he didn't even talk about at all. But other parts of the Bible speak to those issues. So that's one thing. But yes, there have been, in order to justify the enslavement of Africans, parts of the Bible have been used to have been quoted in order to justify the mistreatment of Africans. So there's a part in the Bible, and it talks about Noah and stuff, but basically the sons of Ham were supposed to have this kind of mark of inferiority. And so people have read into that meant black people. So yes, the Bible has been used in that way, but it's really a misinterpretation. And it's just misinterpretation. So, so the question about the white church, and let me back up. Martin Luther King Jr. said 50 years ago that the most segregated hour in America is 11 o'clock on Sunday. And what he was talking about, church houses of worship, right? Now, I am part of the problem, so to speak, because I choose to go to an all-black church because I love the black worship style. Yeah, I just love it. So am I racist for that? I don't think so, but that's a question, right? Spring forward to today's context, there really has to be an ongoing discussion, and we're seeing this more in evangelical circles. Is like, well, who are we worshiping? Are we worshiping God? Are we worshiping white supremacy? Are we worshiping the God of tranquility? So the God in that latter context, I'm saying like we don't want to raise issues in our church and divide the congregation because they're just too hard and people are going to leave. What I'm telling faith leaders of all, of anybody who asks me, I'm like, look, your churches are emptying and getting older because young people are looking at you. They see you're not speaking to the issues of the day. And so they're just fighting this fight elsewhere. That's why they're forming meetup groups or doing stuff on social media. And if you were just to respond to the issues of the day as Jesus did in his time, and if you just follow what Jesus says, care for the sick, the hungry, the imprisoned, love one another, maybe people would start coming to your house of worship. So, these questions have to be made. And I know some people may think that I'm speaking out of shop too much, but I love the church. The church has been a very positive influence in my life, but I know that's not been the case for everyone. And I know that church and Christians have done a lot of damage to people. So as a Christian of goodwill, I'm trying to let people know there are some of us out there who do want to love everyone and bring us together. We just need help.
Wow. What a thank you for coming on and hearing your voice. I've learned a lot today from you, Adrian, from food to religion, my friend. What a fascinating talk.
Thank you so much. Then thanks for the opportunity to just kind of share my thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is wonderful. Thank you so much, Adrian. Everybody, continue to check out chooseinclusion.com. We've got some really great voices that are continuing to join us and share. So thank you for trusting us for that. Check the website. Mike, thank you. Adrian, again, thank you so much. This has been amazing.
All right, cool.
Thank you,
All right, everybody.
Thanks, you, Barbara.
All right, peace.
Always. Take care.
Bye-bye.